We're in First Peter chapter 3 and verse 1 and following, and it's a very difficult position in the text for the woman. Evidently, what had taken place is that the wife alone had been converted to Christ, and she's married to an unbelieving husband who's antagonistic towards this situation. You need to understand that in the ancient world, it was a very difficult position and role for the woman. And that's also true in many parts of the world today. It was expected that the woman would follow the religion of her husband. And when the woman was converted to Christ, apart from her husband, that caused some real difficult problems for her. As a matter of fact, it actually put her in a precarious position. And you can understand that even in parts of the world today. Just imagine for a moment that a Muslim woman is converted to Christ in that part of the world. She would be cast out, perhaps, or certainly not very tolerated and abused. So it's relevant to a lot of people in the world today. So in First Peter chapter 3, let's look and see what Peter has to say and what advice he gives to a woman in that very, very difficult position. And let me stress that in 1 Corinthians 7, that this position of a wife who was married to an unbelieving husband actually broke up the family. And the unbelieving husband had left. So I'm trying to stress, and it's hard for us to imagine, I suppose, that how difficult the position that the woman who converted to Christ, how difficult and what a uh, just a very difficult and hard place to be. So in First Peter chapter 3, let's look at this for just a moment this morning. Likewise, or in the same manner, and of course he had been talking about the slave who was to be submissive to the master. And so what he's suggesting here is, well, not suggesting really, but saying that the woman is to be in submission to her husband, that is to be obedient. And so he goes on to say that be in subjection to your own husbands if they obey not the word. Now, in the NIV, it says not to believe, and that's just too soft because the King James here is actually literally more accurate to the language. What this really refers to is a husband who is obstinate to the gospel. The implication is that he's either heard it from a preacher or he's heard it from his wife, and he's stubbornly obstinate. And actually, the word carries the idea of being antagonistic. So he is opposed to this situation altogether. He doesn't want to hear it. He's not willing to listen. He doesn't want anything to do with the gospel. And yet the problem in the home, what we might call a real domestic problem, not over money, but over religion. And so here is a woman who is married to an unbelieving husband, and he is upset with this and he doesn't like it. And so he says, now that you, rather that you without a word, and that's the idea here, instead of nagging him and arguing with him and acting, in an improper way, you are to be silent. That is, by your demeanor and your behavior, your disposition, your attitude, demonstrate to him what would be coming of the gospel. And so he says that they might be won by your behavior. So you can have an influence even on someone who is opposed to Christ. And it's by your behavior. You don't nag him and pester him, but you, by your behavior, demonstrate to him the gospel and what it really means to live by that. And so in verse 2, well, they behold, and by the way, you understand that by behold they see and they can witness your behavior, and nobody knows who you're like except for in the home. I mean, you live together, you dwell together, and each spouse knows each other better than anybody else does. And what he is beholding is your chaste or pure behavior. And notice this too, that coupled with fear or reverence. Now, what he means there, I believe, believe is that in the situation that the woman is married to an unbelieving husband, that she shows respect and reverence to her husband instead of arguing and quarreling and disobedient and giving him a hard time over this. And so in verse 3, really verse 3 is a great verse because when he begins to talk about the value of beauty, and of course the problem in America, or at least the emphasis is on outward beauty. So he's speaking about that you're to be attractive to him not by your external beauty. And I know that, especially in our culture, that external beauty is more emphasized than internal. And so he's going to speak about that by that I'm sorry, verse 3, whose adorning let it not be of the outward adorning. And it's interesting, the word adorning is where we get the word cosmetic, but the word really referred to orderly arrangement, where you get the idea of the cosmos. And so he's not saying, you ought to look like a mess and disorderly, but he's going to talk about the way that your life ought to be arranged, and what ought to be emphasized is your inward beauty and not your outward. Now, he's not prohibiting, he's not saying you ought not to look nice and you ought not to dress nice. But what he's saying is what really ought to be emphasized. And if you want to really reach the other person's heart, it's by your attitude and your disposition. And so this is what he has to say: whose adorning let it not be of the outward adorning, the braiding of the hair and the wearing of gold and the putting on of the apparel. Now, understand, he is not prohibiting looking nice, and he's not prohibiting going to the beauty parlor and get your hair done and buying a nice dress and looking good. He's not saying wear a burlap sack and wear drab clothes. He's making a contrast here. Let me help you with this for just a moment. Jesus said in John 9, work not for the food that perishes, but for the food that lasts forever, or eternal life. Now, if you were to take that literally, when he says work not for the food, you wouldn't go to work tomorrow. So he's making a contrast, what should be emphasized. Now, back in those days when they would get their hair done, and it's a little different than today, maybe, but it was a real process, because in Rome they would wear those towering hairdos, and the only way you could hold it up was putting braces in it, well, braces, but brackets in it, and well, they didn't have bobby pins, but they had to stick a lot of stuff in there to keep that thing up there. They didn't have hairspray, and I don't think hairspray would even have worked. So this was some kind of a process. And in fact, I was reading some of the scholars that said that women even were wary of going to bed at night. They didn't want to mess up their hair. And so it was quite a process, and it was a lot of vanity. And yet what women wanted to do, as many do today, was to look beautiful outward. And again, I don't want to give you the idea that you ought not to look good. You ought to look as nice as you can. But the emphasis is not on the outward beauty, but it's on the inward beauty. And that's what he's saying is how you can possibly reach your unbelieving husband. So he goes on to say, let it be of the head and heart of the man or the woman here in context, that it's your inward beauty that really, really matters. And then he couples that with two thoughts here. One is a meek, and that is a gentle spirit. I mean, if you're harsh and you're ugly and you're hard to deal with, that's all that's going to do is push a person away. And so he talks about having a meek and quiet, calm spirit. And I can't get into this today, but there's so much disagreement and arguing and quarreling in the home. And if that person's a Christian, it's unbecoming, and it certainly will not win an unbelieving husband. But for this manner, the old time, now he's going to give us an example for the woman to look at, that the holy women of old, they trusted in God, and that's the reason they adorned themselves inwardly, being in subjection to their own husbands. Now you got to understand that in those days, it was the social structure and the order that in the family, the man was the head of the house. And that was the order and the structure that God had instituted. And so he's talking about that's the structure that God put us in. That's the position that you're in. And in this position or structure that you live in, and sometimes it's all some structures that in society are not the most ideal. We just talked about a master and slave relationship. God didn't institute that, but that was the structure and the realm which they found themselves in. And the advice was, how do you live in that structure how do you fit in and position yourself? And this is the same kind of thing here. Here in that world and the world is supposed to be here because this is instituted by God, that in this structure of the family, the man is the head of the house, and the woman, by her own submission, her own choice, puts herself in submission to her husband because it's God's will. And the adorning that she is emphasizing is inward by being a person of good behavior and attitude and disposition. So he gives the example of Sarah, who obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and Peter goes on to say, "Your daughters of He, you're like her, if, of course, you act and display yourself in the same way." And so Sarah was in submission, and we don't have time to get into all that, but if you give it some consideration, she followed her husband, she obeyed her husband, went into an unknown land, didn't know where that land was going to take her, lived a nomadic life, lived in tents, and she was submissive to her husband and followed him. And she had the right attitude in doing so. She found herself, if you want to say it, in that position and in that structure. And in that structure that God had given her, she lived out the Christian life or the life that God wanted her to live. Now, let me go on to say, because he's going to say something important here, that you do this as well, but you don't be afraid. King James is a little confusing here of amazement, but I think all he's simply saying is that you don't submit because you have fear. In some homes, maybe the woman submits and obeys her husband because she knows of the abuse or the mistreatment. And that's an awful situation to be in. It's not a good situation. But I think what he's really saying is you submit because it's the will of God, not because you're intimidated or forced into it. And so that's what he's saying to the woman, and he doesn't say much about the man here. Paul says a whole lot more about the man in Ephesians chapter 5, but we don't have time to get into all that. But he mentions to the husband here that you dwell, and I think he's speaking now to the Christian husband, that you dwell with them according to knowledge and understanding, giving honor to the wife as the weaker vessel. Now, most commentators, and they're probably right on this, the man or the spirit of man dwells in a stronger vessel, in a stronger body. He's stronger. And the woman, of course, is in a weaker vessel. She's not in a vessel perhaps that is as physically strong as the man. He's certainly not saying this, that the woman is emotionally weaker or mentally or intellectually weaker. I don't believe that's it. But let me give you a suggestion here that might be a possibility. When the woman married a man in those days, she put herself in a position that was weaker than the man. In other words, she put herself in submission to the man. And it put her in a weaker position, if you want to use that word, where she would be vulnerable and she could be exploited and she could be led, in places where she would not have been if she'd been independent. So there's a possibility that here, that in the submissive role, that she's actually in a position that, if you want to use the word loosely, in a weaker position. So he's given advice, of course, to a woman who's not in the best of situations, living with an unbelieving husband, and she is to do good and act right and have the right demeanor and attitude in that situation. Was it an ideal situation? Not at all. And yet, many times the Christian life is not always in an ideal situation. So those are some food for thought this morning about the woman in the household of an unbelieving husband and the difficulty and adversity that might be there. She is to live in a way that's pleasing to God. So we'll start tomorrow. And by the way, I want to mention to you from now on, I think that we're going to start it at 12 noon when you're taking your lunch break. You can listen to some of the things that the Bible has to say. So tomorrow, remember, we're starting at noon and thereafter. So I'll see you tomorrow at 12 o'clock.